but what we're really interested in are relationships and connections. Joe calls them communities of knowledge. We've called them networks. Mm-hmm. But the kind of thesis that we're going on is that sort of temperatures along the border may rise and fall, opportunities may come and go, but the bedrock of things may be these long-standing relationships among people who have a special relationship to the place, the culture, the interconnections. And in talking to Joe, he talks about anthropology and the long tradition at the University of Arizona about people who are interested in Mexico, in northern Mexico. And what we want to talk to you about is your own intellectual history, and how you got embedded in this place, how you got to where you got to, and how you maintain those relationships, and sort of what are the characteristics of people who do this, and how do they maintain those things over time, and where do you think things are going. So I guess where we'd like you to begin, and that's right, isn't it, is with your own kind of biography, sort of how you came to find, of all the places in the world, this ungodly, forbidding, difficult terrain to do your work in.
Yeah, I tackled, or I wrote about some of that in an introductory essay that I wrote for David Burkhalter's La Vida Norteña.
Okay, I'm sorry, I should have looked at it.
And my family moved to Arizona when I was 3. So I'm, nearly a native, not quite. But, my father came out, he was a savings and loan executive, and he moved to Phoenix basically to ride the boom, the post-war boom, and we moved to Arizona in 1955. So, I grew up in the northern Sonoran Desert, although Phoenix has done its very best to try and divorce itself from its desert surroundings. My earliest contact with Sonora, with Mexico, was every so often we'd go down and go deep sea fishing in Guaymas, and so I can remember as a kid driving down, crossing the border at Nogales. I have vivid memories of the railroad cars outside Imuris that, railroad workers were living in. And we used to stay at the old Playa de Cortez, that beautiful old Southern Pacific hotel. But, I never really, that was, other than that, and that was my earliest introduction to northern Mexico. I guess when we were even younger than that, back in the days when any living, breathing human being could import a gallon of liquor duty free, people would borrow neighborhood kids, load them into a station wagon and make liquor runs to Nogales,
Yeah, right.
And so I had that, contact with border towns. And then when I was in high school, occasionally we'd go down to Nogales or Rocky Point to drink. But, Sonora really wasn't on my radar. And, in high school, I wanted to get away from Arizona. And, I wanted to go read Gary Snyder and Allen Ginsberg at Big Sur. And I actually went to Reed College for a semester. But I write about this in that essay.
Okay.
The desert cup kept pulling me back, and I had a checkered undergraduate college career. Dropped out twice for a year, And when I went back to school, I went to the original Prescott College. And so that's probably where my first set of networks were created. You know, that's where I met Gary Nabhan and Amadeo Rea, and all the anthropologists, Bob Euler, George Gummerman, Hank Dobbins, who was sort of my first mentor in anthropology.
Yeah.
As well as a lot of, you know, all the different students who, you know, so much of the emphasis on Prescott was getting out and doing field work.
Yes.
And so I can remember I first fell in love with Sonora when Hank Dobbins, who was, Prescott had this core semester, kind of like Colorado College, where, you know, you take one class for 3.5 weeks, then you have like a semester, and then, so Hank Dobbins was teaching this course on like anthropological methods, and he took us all down to the Magdalena Fiesta. And it really was like falling in love. I was just infatuated with how things looked, how they smelled, how they sounded. And after that, you know, whenever I had any free time, I went south rather than north. And I used to think that, you know, of the people at Prescott College, there were the desert people and the plateau people. And some people, you know, were captivated by the Colorado Plateau and the Grand Canyon.
Yeah.
And then others of us, you know, headed down to the Sonoran Desert and even further south. And so, you know, I just started to travel to Mexico whenever I could. Sometimes with, you know, other people from Prescott College, and other times alone. When I was, I think, my 3rd year at Prescott, I took a visual anthropology course where we spent 3.5 weeks in Kino Bay, and then I went down and did an independent study and ended up living in Kino for like 4 months. And so that's the first time I did any extended field work in Sonora. And that also, you know, that's where I, you know, began to establish some networks with
Mexicans.
Yeah.
Right.
And then Prescott sort of, the original Prescott College disintegrated.
Yes.
All the anthropologists left. So I came down to U of A, which at that time was, you know, sort of much more embedded in the region than it is now, especially in the anthropology department. And I was able to take a couple of independent studies with Deb Spicer, who I really, that's the reason I came down to U of A. You know, I wanted to work with Spicer because I'd gotten really interested in the Yaqui Indians. So, and then after finishing my BA, I, you know, went on, and after 2.5 weeks in law school, went on in anthropology. And at that time, I'd say the majority of the graduate students were Southwesternists,
right.
Either archaeologists or cultural anthropologists. And so, you know, there were a whole group of us interested in working on the region. And there were also, you know, lots of other students in other departments who were interested in the region, and there were a couple of sort of informal clubs, or
Okay.
there was the Menudo Society, which was primarily geoscientists and biologists, but also some anthropologists. And, we'd meet on a regular basis, have potlucks, sometimes up on Tumamoc Hill. But this was also a time when, Paul Martin and Ray
Yes.
Turner were taking their grad students down to Mexico. And Mexico was a much safer place to travel in back then. And so people would just, go down there.
Yeah.
To do ecological research, anthropological research,
I'm
historical
glad you mentioned
research.
Tumamoc Hill. I've forgotten. Ezekiel Escura talked about the people at Tumamoc Hill
Yeah,
and how important they were
yeah,
to his connection. And it's interesting, your narrative is so kind of similar. He came to the U of A, he met other people, who were interested in this region, felt at home, and then of course fell in love with the Pentecotes. But it was that same sort of, it was his graduate work, but the graduate work was based on also these sort of associations that led to kind of permanent networks.
right, right. And, and Gary and I, our lives kept intersecting, and
did you know Susan Anderson then too?
no.
Okay, all right. Somebody, Ezekiel.
So, Gary, when Gary came to the U of A, he, Dick Felger
Yeah.
was an important mentor of him, and then, through Gary, I met Dick and the, sort of the crew up in Esperero Canyon where they were living at the time. That was when Dick was living with Mahina. So, there was that kind of network, and Dick hired me to, to do some. The other important thing was, as a graduate student, I started to work for the Documentary Relations of the Southwest at the Arizona State Museum that Charlie Pulzer founded.
Okay.
And through that, got involved in the Southwestern Mission Research Center, the SMRC,
Yes.
and began going on the mission tours. And so that was another whole network of both Mexicans and gringos. So anyway, Dick hired me to do, to look through the Spanish colonial documents for information about the Seris. And so, there were just all of these overlapping networks that people would kind of come together and,
Mm-hmm.
but the one common denominator was everybody was in love with,
Yes.
well, the Sonoran Desert in particular, but, oftentimes with an even broader region.
Mm-hmm.
And through both anthropology and SMRC, I also at DRSW I worked with a lot of historians and graduate students in the history department. So beginning in the 70s, we would go down and give papers at these different Sonoran history symposiums.
In Mexico.
In Sonora, yeah.
All right. So you have always had then these kind of connections with other people in Sonora. One of the things we're kind of finding out in the environmental field is that it's often a Mexican who comes to study here, and they bring a kind of an appreciation of Mexico into one of these environmental groups. But in this sense, you actually have continuing relationships with people who don't come up here
Yeah.
Right. And that began here because they were already interested in this stuff. I mean, I think it's really interesting they have a Sonoran history meeting.
Well, for a while there were two of them.
Really?
Two different ones. And, you know, they published the proceedings from them. And but that, it wasn't just people in Sonora, but that also drew historians from Mexico City, people like Ignacio del Rio and Sergio Noriega, you know, who were interested in Sonora and Baja, and they would come and give papers. And so, and through the DRSW project, we would go down and do archival research in Mexico City. So, you know,
talk about this in the past. Is this now no longer the case that historians in Mexico are not interested in the Sonoran history anymore? Or is
these things have
continued.
These things have continued. Yes,
okay.
My involvement. I mean, I
is not. All right.
As you know, I haven't been doing active research south of the border for a while now.
Right.
But certainly through the 80s and early 90s, it was a major focus. You know, and then I went down and did my dissertation research in Cucurpe, Sonora.
Yes.
And there also have been very strong ties between the State Museum, the Anthropology Department, and the Centro Noroeste of INA, the Instituto Nacional de Anthropología y Historia.
Yeah.
Now, none of this necessarily deals with the environment, but these are all the networks that, you know, that were important to me.
Well, that sort of leads to this larger question of what are the relationships among these networks. And when we talked earlier today to people from the OODOM, they talked about there really isn't a separation between environment and people and culture. These things all kind of fit together, and so much of the things that are lost begin with the loss of a piece of territory that has embedded in it this kind of historical memory.
Right.
And maybe this is the kind of a region where the land and the cultural history are especially intricately combined.
Yeah, well, I think they are everywhere, but I think it's been a focus of a lot of both social and ecological research. Were
you at Barra?
No.
Never at Barra.
No.
So
I've been.
Your sort of career here at the university, was it in the anthropology department?
No, it was well, I got my PhD, but I worked from the museum.
That's right, of course.
You know, full time from 1984 to 2003.
So you worked for Ray Thompson, at least part of that time. And then you moved over here in 2000 here. Right.
2003, I moved over here.
Okay.
And
I have a question though. Just go back to what you said about every place has history, like you were suggesting. But I just moved from Pennsylvania, and so much of that history has no connection to the present. Whereas in this area, you still have the connection of the history very much embedded in the culture.
Right.
I'm not an anthropologist, but I wonder, is that true? Does that make this area distinctive?
I think
Say from Pennsylvania, where it's all like gone, there's no tribal connection there anymore.
Yeah, and I think part of that is that Spanish Indian policy was radically different from British Indian policy. You know, the Brits and later us I mean, the Brits made alliances with Indian groups like the Iroquois, but in their wars with other European powers. But once those were settled, their primary thrust was to push the Indians westward. They did not systematically try and incorporate native peoples into their societies. The Spaniards, on the other hand, did. They wanted to save Indian souls, but they also relied to a much greater extent on Indian labor. So their whole focus was to, bring Indians into the empire. And, in many ways, I don't want to say their Indian policy was humane, but it was certainly much more proactive and much more incorporating than either the British or the French. And I think, for a number of different reasons, including that, fundamentally different outlook, they also, intermarried with Indians. The color line was much weaker in the Spanish Empire than it was in the British Empire. And certainly on the northern frontier, there were black slaves, but to a far lesser extent than there was, say, in the southern British colonies or the U.S. So all of those things, I think are the reasons why, when you look at where Indian people live today, so many more Indian people live in the Southwest, in the former parts of the Spanish Empire, than they do certainly along the East Coast.
And there's, to go back to the metaphor of the weaving, there's the interweaving of both the landscape and the peoples in a way that doesn't exist in other East Coast, let's just say, east of the Mississippi, for example, which again, there's a sort of fabric issue here then in terms of interconnectedness and legacy.
You had the Native American societies with, in some cases, 4 centuries of Spanish and Mexican society, and then for the last century and a half, the Anglo-American arrival. And because the area was a frontier for such a long time, a lot of those peoples survived. And whereas, again, you look at where Indians, if Indian peoples survived, who originally lived on the East Coast, most of them ended up west of the Mississippi River or in Oklahoma, because they were just continually pushed further and further. Indians don't like Andrew Jackson. He's not a hero to them. Whereas, the Spanish, for the most part, was trying to bring Indians into missions and
settle.
If we focus just a little bit on particularly Native Americans, and it's sort of following this theme about the importance of people and their connections, but also institutions like the University of Arizona, like Tumamoc Hill, and like these legacies of students and their graduate students and so on. If we move on then to law, earlier today we talked about the importance of preservation acts to require anthropological digs before you put in something like the CAP. How important are laws, or in some sense are they kind of the consolation prize for a bunch of this stuff? I never quite know. The Arizona State Museum, I know, had lots of contracts because of the federal laws requiring.
There's all sorts of federal laws,
right.
But and actually I can't remember the name.
Well, obviously, can I?
there's a whole series of laws, but beginning in the 70s, anything that involved federal funding, you had to do archaeological survey and mitigation, and that spawned an enormous amount of research, and it created an industry, a private sector archaeological industry that primarily focused on archaeology, although now it's beginning to involve, through like traditional cultural properties, some cultural research as well. But it was primarily a real boon to archaeologists, and many of my fellow graduate students went on to work for or establish some of these contract firms, and now firms like Desert Archaeology and its not-for-profit sister organization, the Center for Desert Archaeology, they have more PhD anthropologists working for them than most universities.
Well, granted, it certainly did a lot for archaeology, and I used to talk to Ray Thompson about this, and he was really a very firm backer of this stuff, and really he cared about the updating of the law and the extension of it and that kind of stuff. But what does it exactly do for the Native Americans? And does it, in the long run, sort of deepen the appreciation in the broader society for this stuff? Does it give them a leg up when they want to claim their heritage?
Well, the key law there was NAGPRA.
Okay.
And that was a revolutionary law that initially I think a lot of museums and archaeologists were scared to death of.
This repatriation.
Yeah, because all of a sudden Native Americans could step up and claim all the booty that had been collected by museums over the past century. I think one really positive result of that, however, has been much more collaboration between anthropologists and Native Americans.
That's what I was wondering.
And it's also as Indians have really explored and utilized the concept of sovereignty, they have established much more control over the kind of research that's done on reservation. And so this, the Southwest has been was probably the premier anthropological laboratory in the world. Maybe British Africa challenged that, but beginning in the late 1800s, hundreds of anthropologists have been trained. Archaeologists and cultural anthropologists and linguistic anthropologists have been trained in the Southwest. But the old pattern of just being able to go and do research with Native peoples, where the research was controlled by the anthropologists rather than by the tribes, that's over.
Okay.
And so now, in most cases, before you do research, or if you ethically do research, you have to get the permission of the tribe, and oftentimes tribes only allow research that they want done, and in many cases, they control the products of that research. So, for example, Chuck Adams worked on Walpi, and that's never been published and may never be published.
It's interesting.
T.J. Ferguson, my colleague with the Hopi History Project, much of his research are unpublished reports that he's done for the Hopi or the Zuni tribes. So it's changed the rules of the game completely.
Now, Mexican indigenous people don't have similar.
The difference is that, you know, there's no reservation system in Mexico.
Right.
There's no NAGPRA. Indian people in Mexico don't have the legal tools or the land bases that Indians in the United States have. Their access to land is within the comunidad or ejido systems. And oftentimes that's mediated. I mean, they may be in an ejido with a lot of mestizos. So they don't have that, you know, sovereign control of territory like Indians in the United States do. On the other hand, you know, Mexico has this whole post-revolutionary ideology that we're the cosmic race, this mestizo nation, but you know, when you look at the actual realities of Indian people in Mexico today, if and when sovereignty is sort of advanced, it's in a very different way, like the Zapatistas, for example.
Yeah.
And I've been told the Seri are probably one of the, and the Yaqui, at least in Mexico, are one of the few that really have secured somewhat of a land base and a cultural identity and a...
Well, the Yaquis, the Yaqui Reserve was created by Cardenas in the 1930s, you know, to about a third of what they claimed as their homeland. The Seri thing's been really recent. That's a work in progress. That's just in the last 20 years or so. So, you know,
is there any connection between the sort of anthropological work we're talking about and the cross-border work and the sort of establishment of this Seri Reserve? And is there a relationship among Yaquis north and south of the border that is mutually reinforcing and helpful? Is there a binational component to this?
Well, I mean, I don't know how accurately I can answer because I really haven't been directly involved in that. I think that, you know, in terms of you know, the institution that's key to anthropological research in Mexico is INA, because it controls access, it controls patrimony. You know, again, if you want to work with Indian peoples in Mexico, you have to get permission from INA to do so. So there's kind of a monopoly there. I mean, there's all sorts of interesting issues about, you know, repatriation that are, you know, only beginning to surface in Mexico. But, you know, I think that the networks that are, you know, that are active, you know, involve U.S. researchers who have some formal connection with INA, either in Baja or Sonora or Chihuahua.
And the INA staff, where are they trained? In Mexico City? Do they do some of their work up here in the U.S. and then go down?
Most of them are trained at least for their bachelor's and master's in Mexico City. But then, you know, some of them, you know, there's at least one linguistic anthropologist at the Centro Noroeste who got his PhD here at U of A, and Jane Hill was his dissertation advisor. And I've got a student who worked for the Centro Noroeste and INA for 5 years. And I've had where I've been on committees of other students, you know.
I thought I kind of knew that you were.
Yeah. So there's the U of A Anthro department has had at least in the last 10 years or so, this sort of steady influx of Latin American grad students. Probably the majority from Mexico, but I've got a student from Paraguay, I've got a student from Colombia, I'm on a committee with a woman from Venezuela, but those are really important.
Well, it's clear that these sort of student-professor relationships have been a way to knit together this sort of network of people. There's no question about that, and the institution of the university is really important about that. What do you think about literature
and INA?
And INA.
And then also, the Colegio de Sonora has become a very important institution.
We're going to talk to Kathy Denman in the morning.
And I think you need to talk to people like Jeff Bannister and Peggy Wilder, because we're
going to talk to we will
more closely. But
talk to us a little bit about books and the production of books such as the kind you write, to both not just as teaching tools, but as a way to broaden this sort of network of people who appreciate the sort of cultural and land and people's heritage of the Southwest. It seems to me we're especially blessed here with a rich literature. Do you agree with that? Or do you think?
Yeah. There's been this, I mean, in anthropology in the last 20 or 30 years, there's been a real more and more incorporation of history. But U of A, long before the discipline kind of went in that direction, there was this sort of core group here at U of A who were, involved in historical research as well as ethnographic field work. Ned Spicer's the best example, but Jim Officer, Bunny Fontana, and the networks that I interacted with them was not only the university network, but also SMRC, Mission Tours, because it's sort of been diluted a little bit. But originally SMRC, the core group of SMRC were, Charlie Pulser, Bunny Fontana, Big Jim Griffith, Jim Officer, scholars who also wanted to sort of bring their scholarship to a wider public.
And it's kind of nice because they also took people to these sites, so they had a field experience.
Right.
So it was not just the literature, it was also this sort of shared transboundary experience.
And it always involved an environmental component, too, because we had, generally on Sunday mornings, we almost always had, we called it a nature walk, or for years we'd stop. There's a mountain pass on the highway east of Caborca where you can see all four columnar cacti, saguaros, cardone, and the two organ pipes. And so we give a little 30-minute talk about desert ecology and desert plants and how people use them. So the environment's always been, been a part of, and I'm going to have to leave at 5:15.
I know. So we won't keep you that long.
I in terms of networks, and I don't know whether this is a little bit off your theme, but it's certainly more, for the last 13, 14 years, most of my focus has been on this side of the border, primarily focusing on issues of, ranching and the conservation of open space. And that, ranching was a big focus of my dissertation, in Sonora. But then, I got intrigued over the, sort of the conflict and the polemics over ranching on public lands that, were so bitter during the 1990s.
I understand why environmentalists hate cows and things that eat grass in it.
Well, what really kicked it off was I was a fellow at the Udall Center, so there's another important institution.
Yes, right.
One that you're probably familiar with.
Yeah, a little bit.
So anyway, while I was doing, kind of looking at, the one thing that ranchers in arid lands have to, the one primary ecological challenge they face is how do you get access to, a lot of land for your cattle or your sheep or your goats to forage on. And they've solved that ecological challenge in very different ways in Mexico as opposed to the United States. And so that was the project I was interested in at the Udall Center. But while I was there, Les Corey and Andy Lorenzi of the Nature Conservancy came to then this is when Kirk Emerson was at the Udall Center.
Right after I left.
In charge of the environmental conflict resolution program there. They came to the Udall Center and said, we feel like we've gotten off on the wrong foot with the ranching community in Arizona. And that was primarily over, they wanted not to graze their allotments after they got the Muleshoe Ranch, and ranchers sued them over that. So, Kirk called me in, and we met with Jim and Sue Chilton and the Parsons at the Mountain Oyster Club, and that led to the creation of what became the Arizona Common Ground Roundtable, which for about 4 years was this revolving kind of working seminar on, what we were trying to figure out is how can you bring environmentalists and scientists and ranchers together rather than, knocking heads? Is there common ground? And, the common ground that we established early on was, we were all concerned over the land fragmentation and, the suburban and exurban development that was chewing up the West.
Yes.
It's interesting. We, groups like the Nature Conservancy, the Sonoran Institute, they came to the table. A lot of environmental groups refused, like the Center for Biological Diversity. And, I sort of started this process, kind of vaguely with an environmentalist bias, and I ended up really coming to sort of despise a lot of these, environmentalists who just refuse to try and collaborate.
It's an odd thing because I always thought environmentalists at their center of their hell, I think was a dam, and I don't think so. I think it's grazing. They're kind of nutty.
Well, it was then anyway, at least here in the Southwest. But anyway, that led to more and more involvement in these issues, and then that led me into other networks. And then the second thing that happened in '97 was the whole fight over Canoa Ranch, and Ray Carroll had just been, I forget the name of the Republican who died, and Grijalva wanted a Green Republican and sort of handpicked Ray, and Ray was opposed, Fairfield Homes wanted requested a rezoning of, they had bought Kanoa, the south half of the old Kanoa land grant. So Ray called a group of us together, and I ended up, being chair of the group, and we founded the Kanoa Heritage Foundation. And that fight was the first time in like 25 years that the Board of Supervisors turned down a major rezoning.
Wow. And
it brought all of these neighborhood groups and environmental organizations and, people like me and astronomers together. And then, the Arizona Common Ground Roundtable was meeting all over the state.
Mm-hmm.
And then a lot of us in the roundtable, some of us got siphoned off as that whole growing smarter thing started to happen on the state level, but I got pulled into the Sonoran Desert Conservation Plan that Pima County developed, and that, which I think is the most visionary and ambitious land use plan maybe in the entire country. But that, that brought all kinds of networks involved in, how do we preserve biodiversity and open space and working ranches in this part of the Sonoran Desert. So those are the kind of the networks that in
Sonoran
a sense,
Desert Conservation Plan, how did it get to be so visionary? One doesn't think about the city of Tucson and urban development and visionary.
Well, the city of Tucson, it's very I want to write a book about that.
Yeah.
And I think about that a lot. It was this remarkable conjunction of a board that was in the process of becoming where finally, after years and years, a majority of the board, particularly with, Ray Carroll, becoming, a majority of people who were environmentalists or at least sympathetic to environmental concerns. That in conjunction with a really remarkable county administration. And, Chuck Huckleberry deserves a tremendous amount of credit for that. But he had, and still has, just truly extraordinary and talented staff, both in cultural preservation and in environmental preservation. Maveen Behan, who just died last fall, was a key person involved in that. And, I don't really know how they got to that point, but what triggered the whole process was the listing of the pygmy owl.
Okay.
Yeah,
And
that's right.
and
I was up in the northwest sector.
prime pygmy owl habitat was in the Northwest, which is the direction that Tucson primarily grew in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And so with that listing, the county knew that it, as well as any other private developer, were going to have to jump through all these ESA hoops. And so they decided, rather than, just trying to react on a species by species basis, they launched this incredibly visionary project to identify what are not just listed endangered or threatened species, but what are all the native species that are vulnerable to the kind of urbanization and suburbanization and exurbanization that Metro Tucson has.
And Fish and Wildlife Service and the state fish and game were also very I was at Audubon Society at the time that started.
Oh yeah, I mean there were all kinds
Money to be had,
all kinds
studies being done.
But so the county anyway decided we're going to seek a multi-species habitat conservation plan, which is an amendment to the ESA.
Mm-hmm.
And so they created these technical advisory groups, including I think what was misnamed the Science Technical Advisory Group, to try and identify what species were. I think there were 7 or 8 listed species, but originally they had a list of 55 species. Priority vulnerable species is what they called them. And then because of the roundtable and because of Kanoa, they asked me to chair the Ranch Conservation Technical Advisory Team, because they established 6 major goals for the SDCP, including the conservation of working ranches. And I'm not really sure how I would need to ask Chuck why that became one of the 6 goals, but their argument was that working ranches have defined the urban boundaries of Tucson. And probably the cheapest and best way to define those boundaries was to keep working ranches working. So anyway,
what's your impression of how well this is being implemented, or how much the plan is being followed, or whether pressures over time? Has this network stayed together to sort of...
Absolutely. It's stayed together and it's strengthened.
That's what I want to know.
And the county at the very beginning explicitly said we want to create a firewall between the science and all the political pressures. So they told the sciences to devise a conservation land system as if none of these other things matter, and they did. And then the key thing that happened, that was adopted as their comprehensive land use management plan. But the big thing, the really thing that made that work was the 2004 open space bond, which gave the county about $170 million to buy or conserve open space. And so every major ranch that's come up for sale since that bond was passed, the county's bought.
It's really great.
And I mean, it could disintegrate. We could get a board that isn't committed to this, and it'll be interesting to see. And the habitat conservation plan has still not been finalized.
So I hope you're right about this.
It's a really complex process, but it brought all of these different networks, and some critical alliances were formed. The Coalition for Sonoran Desert Protection, this umbrella group of about 40 to 50 neighborhood groups and environmental organizations, was a key player, and particularly its director, Carolyn Campbell.
Who was part of the Common Ground? No?
No.
Where was she before that name?
I think she was Molly McCasson's.
That's right. That's how I know her. She was Molly McCasson's
aide.
Yeah.
She's been a major player. Another major player was it's now the Arizona Land and Water Trust, but the Arizona Land Trust that Diana Freshwater is the director of.
Are those the 2 people we should talk to?
Absolutely. Diana, all of the negotiations for these ranch purchases were done by the Arizona Land Trust under the radar, before the county bought them. So it's been this extraordinary collaboration between public and private entities, between grassroots organizations, and the contrast between the county, which I think is probably, environmentally anyway, the most progressive county in the country.
Who'd have thunk 20 years ago?
Yeah, exactly.
And, you know, the absolutely dysfunctional city of Tucson.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, Rio Nuevo was this incredible opportunity, and they've completely botched it.
What a horror.
You know, so it's why the difference? You know, I've got to think that personalities play a big role, and you know,
personalities and maybe pre-existing networks.
Probably. I mean, and obviously Chuck Huckleberry is
right.
Chuck Huckleberry, Raul Grijalva,
Wow.
Ray Carroll, more recently. And I'm going to have to leave.
Yeah, but boy, that's such a contribution. Wow.
I mean,
it's really helpful to
you know,
us.
it just scratches the surface. There's
Well,
so
Tom,
much
this
more.
has been really great. Thank
so
you.
much more.
Well, and I'm going to do now some homework on this and add this piece. That's very important. Thank you. Thank you. Really, really helpful.
And one of
it's
the
kind
one
of
of the
interesting.
things that we've seen is that there's a spillover effect as Tucson began to be exercise more control over development. Some of that development during the boom got displaced to other counties. But also other counties have, you know, like Cochise and Santa Cruz and Pinal are intrigued by what we're doing, and also other jurisdictions, you know, City of Tucson, Marana, Oro Valley, they're all developing their own kind of environmental programs modeled after this county SDCP. You know, Bruce Babbitt was key during the early years when he was Secretary of the Interior. You know, it's just, and how that plugs into these earlier networks we're talking about, you know,
Yeah.
you know, it's sort of a, you know, a rolling, I don't know what the right metaphor is, but, you know, it's always a work in progress, and networks that were established earlier are activated, you know, as
these opportunities which this planning process presented. The planning process sort of set the table to provide where the things could be brought together.
Yeah.
Which is what planning processes are supposed to do, so.
But you know, my first impression of the county when I was involved, after we beat the rezoning, then the county entered into these negotiations with Fairfield, and it had this quote-unquote facilitation process, which was, a lot of us felt was, you know, just a charade that Maveen was, you know, you don't have one of the major partners facilitate the process, but Maveen facilitated it. And my impression of both Maveen and Chuck then was that they felt they were, really felt that they were both control freaks, and they hoped to sort of control these processes from the top down. And I think their initial attempts to structure the Sonoran Desert Conservation Plan reflected that, but it was too big, and they couldn't control every detail. And to their credit, I think they recognized that they had to become much more accommodating of these grassroots efforts. But it's been an ongoing negotiation. But as I say, all sorts of really interesting partnerships developed. I think one of the critical ones that I didn't see happen directly, because it was on the steering committee, which was this self-selected group of more than 80 people that everybody thought the county had basically structured to fail as a sort of, okay, well, this is our sop to public input.
Right.
And for about the first 3 years, it was absolutely unwieldy. But then a group of the steering committee got together, and I think a critical alliance was Carolyn Campbell and this realtor named Bill Arnold, who, is as conservative as they come. But, what it led me to realize is that realtors and developers are two very different cats, and the realtors, at least some of them, began to see that preserving open space would make the properties that they were trying to sell more valuable. And so it's been a really fascinating.
Yeah, it sounds like it. I look forward to your book.
Well, one of these days.
Yeah.
Yeah.